Welcome to Wisdom Time. Have you ever noticed that a lot of the great stories from the past kind of sound the same? Whether you're looking at ancient tablets or holy books, you see these tales pop up over and over, just with different names and places. Well, today we're going to get to the bottom of why that is. And the answer, it might just be hiding in the memes on your phone. So let's just jump right in. This is the big question. How is it possible that stories from totally different cultures and times, I'm talking Islamic traditions, ancient Sumerian tablets, Central Asian epics, how can they all sound so weirdly similar? I mean, is this just some huge ancient game of copy and paste? Or is there something way more interesting going on here? Okay, so that brings us to our first section, the ancient echoes question. Because when you see these incredible overlaps in stories, it's really tempting to jump to a conclusion that's as old as the stories themselves. And look, we're not just talking about a couple of coincidences. This pattern is everywhere. You see it in the life of Siddhartha, the founder of Buddhism. You see it in these grand Turkish epics, and even in the biographies of great scholars. These echoes are just undeniable, and they've got to mean something, right? For a lot of people, seeing this pattern leads to a pretty blunt conclusion. All these stories must just be myths, made up, fables. In the Quran, this exact idea is captured in the phrase asatir al-awwalin, which means fables of the ancients. The logic feels pretty straightforward. If all the stories sound the same, well, they must all be fake. But what if that's completely the wrong way to look at this problem? So let's flip this around and explore a totally different possibility in our next section, stories cast in molds. This is where we might just find the hidden pattern that unlocks this entire puzzle. All right, the key concept here is something called a narrative mold. The easiest way to think about it is like a cookie cutter, but for stories. It's a template, a structural pattern that storytellers use to shape an event. And here's the kicker. Our brains are absolutely wired for patterns. A story that fits into a familiar mold isn't just easier to remember. It feels right, it feels more true, and it's so much easier to pass along. Now, you have to think about the world these stories came from. We're talking about oral cultures, societies where most people couldn't read or write. So for them, these molds weren't just helpful, they were absolutely essential. Without a memorable mold to hold it, a story, no matter how important the event was, would just fall apart and get lost to history. You can actually break this down into a really simple three-step pipeline. First, a real, unique event happens, and someone observes it. Second, to make that story stick, it gets poured into a narrative mold that people already know and love. And third, now that it's in this perfect, easy-to-share format, the story just spreads like wildfire. It goes viral, ancient style. And this right here is probably the most important part to understand. The original events, the things people actually saw, they weren't identical copies of each other. They were just similar. I mean, similar things happen all the time throughout history. The fascinating part is that it's the mold, the storytelling framework, that sands off all the unique details and makes them sound like the exact same story. Okay, I know this might still feel a little abstract, so let's make it super concrete. In this next section, we're going to see how these narrative molds are actually all around us today, in everything from the stories of tyrants to the memes you just scrolled past.
Think about it for a second. An internet meme is just a modern, super fast version of a narrative mold. Just like an ancient epic, it's a vehicle for carrying a message. Yeah, the transmission method changed from, oral poetry to digital images, but the survival mechanism is exactly the same. It has to be simple, recognizable, and super easy to share. High virality is just what we call a story that fits its mold perfectly.
If you want to see a perfect modern example of this whole thing in action, look no further than the Netflix series How to Become a Tyrant. Seriously, it's a masterclass in using a single narrative mold to explain decades of really complex history. So the show takes 6 totally different dictators from different countries, different eras, and it shows how all of them followed this shockingly similar playbook to get power. It brilliantly fits their unique, individual life stories into one single tyrant mold. Now, just imagine if those stories were passed down by word of mouth for 1,000 years. You can bet they would almost certainly merge into one single epic story of the Great Tyrant, even though the original events were totally separate. It's such a powerful way to understand how stories evolve and shape our view of the world. And hey, if you're enjoying frameworks like this that help make sense of complex ideas, please take just a second to subscribe, like this video, and hit that notification bell. It really helps us make more explainers just like this one for you. All right, let's shift gears a little and bring this back to the theological side of things. Because it turns out this whole phenomenon and our very human reaction to it is something ancient texts were already talking about thousands of years ago. And this is where it gets really, really interesting. The Quran doesn't just tell stories, it actually anticipates how people are going to react to them. It speaks directly to the psychology of someone who hears a story, recognizes a familiar pattern, and then immediately tries to dismiss the whole message by attacking the format, calling it just another recycled legend. And here it is, the verse itself from Surah Al-An'am. It says that those who disbelieve, when they hear these narratives, they argue back, saying that this is not but legends of the former peoples. The insight here is just incredible. It's pointing out that confusing a story's structure with its substance isn't some modern, skeptical invention. It's a timeless human reaction. So, after looking at ancient history, modern memes, and theology, this all brings us to our final and most crucial takeaway. What's the one big idea that ties all of this together? What this all boils down to is one single powerful idea. The mold is not the message. The pattern is not the event. Just because a story uses a familiar structure, that doesn't automatically mean the specific event it's describing isn't true. Confusing the two is like hearing an amazing new song and dismissing it just because it uses the same musical notes as 1,000 other songs. And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. If ancient cultures had their heroic epic molds, and we have our internet memes and documentary formulas, what other molds are shaping the stories we hear and believe right now? In our news, in our politics, and maybe even in our own lives?